Glad you could join us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. As the largest economy, leading oil producer, and the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria faces the unique challenge of having to diversify its economy away from fossil fuels while responding to the unmet energy needs of its growing population. Nonetheless, Nigeria wants to turn this challenge into an opportunity by increasing its use of renewable energy, reducing its carbon footprint, and eliminating gas flaring. That is what is targeted in the country's first Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, as it is commonly known, which was submitted to the United Nations in 2017. The NDC is at the heart of the Paris Agreement. They embody efforts by country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impact of climate change. Today on Earthfile, we look at the government's efforts to meet this target. Do stay with us. The Paris Agreement may have set a global goal to limit temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius and build a net zero emission economy this century. But delivering on its ambitious targets rests on the ability of developing countries to secure finance in support of their emission reduction projects. The risk of bold emission reduction plans faltering thanks to a lack of access to finance is made explicit in many of the nationally determined contributions submitted by governments around the world. During the 2015 Paris Summit, numerous emerging economic governments set out plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions or ensure they peak within the coming decades. But time and again, their commitment contained a caveat detailing how their ambitious targets rested on their ability to secure international finance and support.
So we know that there's a commitment on the part of our governments. Whether or not they will actually meet those targets, I think is a challenge not only Africa is facing, but also other countries. So our commitment is to try and work with them and to continue on this journey until we are able to make the transition that enables Africa to develop, but to develop sustainably.
According to current estimates, the negative effects of climate change are already reducing Africa's gross domestic product by about 1.4%. And the costs arising from adaptation to climate change are set to reach an annual 3% of GDP by 2030. These countries have set out ambitious commitments towards climate adaptation and mitigation in their nationally determined contributions, many of which will require significant climate finance and other support in order to be achieved.
The most important thing, I think, in achieving success or obtaining results is commitment from governments. And we have that. And as long as we have that, the rest in terms of policy and regulatory environments, working with the governments to mobilize the resources to enable them to transition, that is something we can do.
Nigeria committed to a 20 to 30% emission reduction by 2030, with a focus on the power, oil and gas, agriculture and land use, transport and industry sectors. The country's NDC's ambition is estimated to cost $142 billion in order to meet the 2030 target.
The good news is Nigeria is doing very well. The biggest challenge Nigeria has had in terms of carbon emissions was its gas flaring and fugitive emissions. We now know Nigeria has the right policy in regulatory framework, and what we are working on is to support its implementation. And that is very important. So we know within the Zero Gas Flaring Initiative, Nigeria is committed to zero flaring by 2030, and we believe it can do that because even as we speak now, the government has already opened up the bids for microgrids based on gas emission capture. So Nigeria is definitely on the right track. And one of the lessons we can draw from Nigeria as an established producer that we are taking to emerging producers that we are working with in the bank, like Mozambique and Kenya and Uganda, is the role that the National Oil Company has played in being part of the process of enabling the country to transition to having a good mix of energies, including renewable energies. So those are some good lessons coming from Nigeria in terms of, one, ensuring that other countries regulate for a zero gas flaring, but also that national oil companies should be part and parcel of the transition process of the government.
Nigeria adopted the National Adaptation Strategy and Plan of Action on Climate Change in 2011 and the Nigerian Climate Change Policy Response Strategy in 2012. These documents are the building blocks of Nigeria's nationally determined contribution, which was further developed into an NDC sectoral action plan for the 5 priority sectors.
The first thing that Nigeria did, which is brilliant, is they broke the NDC down into action plans for each ministry. So the Ministry of Power developed the Energy Sector Action Plan. The oil and gas industry, they developed one for that sector, agriculture, transport. So they gave responsibility to the individual ministries to actually achieve it. And that's important because you can't have an environment ministry trying to tell people what to do. But it also means you align it with the other priorities of those ministries. So I think clean energy is a really good example. Nigeria's got a huge energy crisis. You need to get access to energy to all of the country. And actually the best way to do that is by solar power, by decentralized solar, not by building a big grid out to the farthest parts of the country. So you can identify the win-win solutions in that way.
Nigeria took part in the inaugural Climate Finance Accelerator process in 2017, which has significantly increased dialogue between its public and private sector actors and improved its understanding of how to identify bankable projects. During the 24th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, held in the Polish city of Katowice, the Climate Finance Accelerator brought together policymakers with private sector financiers to identify financing propositions for projects aligning with Nigeria's NDC needs.
We brought together the policymakers who are behind the NDCs from 3 countries, Nigeria, Mexico and Colombia, and we brought them together with the banks who want to invest in low carbon. But equally important, we brought project developers, the guys who've got those entrepreneurial ideas as well. So you had this great meeting place where the policy guy who wants to achieve energy access and climate, you've got a bank who's got a lot of money but is only going to invest it if he can get a return on investment, and someone with an idea that will help both of those. And if you put them in a room and then they can discuss, well, how do you need to adjust the financing of this to make it bankable, so that you'll make money out of it, then you can actually have an honest conversation and everyone learns. They all learn how each other's language work, and you speed up the process of coming up with enough investments to actually deliver the NDC. So we did that in London last year. Nigeria came along. It was a great week. They spent a week with Deutsche Bank, and now we're going to run an in-country accelerator workshop in Nigeria. So that's with the Department of Climate Change, but also with renewable energy promoters, with Nigerian investors. And we're trying to just do that thing where people can understand the opportunity and really see that they can make money out of these things if they're financed in the right way.
The NDC support program will enhance the capacities of key institutions to mobilize finance for Nigeria's action plan, increase private sector participation to catalyze the necessary investment, catalogue climate-related actions undertaken by various parties to measure progress towards the achievement of NDC targets, and help Nigeria inform and raise awareness on the action plan among public and private sector actors.
The real issue is intervene where you need to, but also you've got to engage the entrepreneurs. You've got to be supporting the people that are coming through with new ideas. One of the things people have been talking to me about is the attitude towards solar energy. It's negative. They don't think that they're going to make a return on it. Well, actually, everyone else manages to make a return on it in other countries. So if you can engage the private sector and show them that there's an opportunity there, and the government will help make that happen, remove the barriers, try to come up with some maybe cheaper finance to help make the deals more deliverable. I think that's what government has to do. They have to be assisting the private sector. They can't push the private sector to do it, though. They need to show them the opportunity and then help support them in delivering that.
Delivery of the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement and the global shift towards a decarbonized economy will have profound implications for fossil fuel producing countries like Nigeria.
One of the important gaps that we plan to work with the government actually to support them is to have a monitoring framework, because the policy and regulatory environment to ensure zero carbon emissions from the gas sector is there. But what is the monitoring framework? And then to work with the private sector, because it's a private sector-led commitment. What is also good that we noticed in Nigeria is that the private sector is fully on board with the government commitment to achieving zero gas emissions, zero gas flaring by 2030, and they've made commitments. What we need to do is to monitor, to provide a framework for monitoring that, so that we are able to work towards the target. And that is an institutional framework that for us is institutionalized. It goes beyond who is in government, because as the African Development Bank, we work with the government regardless of who the head of state is.
The new approach is an information that these fossil fuel producing countries will require to effectively manage their energy transitions and deliver long-term emissions plan towards 2050 was the focus of another meeting organized by the African Development Bank and the Chatham House, also held during the UN Climate Conference in Katowice.
There's a question over whether or what kinds of information do countries need to make the best decisions, especially about future scenarios. I think future international market scenarios, but also evolving frameworks for gaining access, for instance, to climate finance. So I think you heard a lot of people today talking about opportunities for different models of development. In Nigeria, in particular, there's so many possibilities for solar energy to solve domestic energy access problems. There's so much potential for agriculture. There's a need to, with desertification taking place, which is actually feeds into the current conflict. Biodiversity and regreening and afforestation is really, really important. So there will become money available for this, and I think Nigeria's green bond is a fantastic example of how you might attract that kind of financing. But how to align it really with an economy that is still, I think government revenue is what dependent maybe about 50%, 60% on the oil sector. So it's about managing that transition and also finding a role for an existing oil sector.
The speakers agreed that development assistance must be aligned with climate and country needs, which should include country NDCs and long-term emissions reduction plans.
It's going to take immense political will, absolutely, and it means explaining, having a strong, comprehensive development vision that you can really communicate to people so that people get behind this. This is really important. I think it needs thinking beyond what has traditionally been thought of as emissions-intensive industrial development. We need to think beyond that. Does a country like Nigeria want to be stuck with those same polluting technologies that China, the US, Britain even are paying high to clean up after, basically? So there's a need for a really big rethink in that sense. Of course, the main majority of responsibility still lies with the developed countries, with the richer economies, and we would, of course, want to see a complete turnaround now from what we have in the US and some of the other countries who seem to be stepping away from their commitments. This is really essential, but I don't like to take the view that we have to wait. I think everybody can make a difference right now, because really this is about our children, this is about future generations.
Direct impact of the shift from fossil fuel to renewable economy will range from volatile and declining fossil fuel revenues over time to potential reductions in the production lifespan of fossil fuel assets. They also imply rapid shifts in the competitiveness of energy technologies and industrial pathways, presenting both carbon risks and green growth opportunities for producer countries. The impact will, of course, vary depending on the country and stage of production, the type and scale of reserves, and the allocation of production between export and domestic use. However, the extent to which countries can mitigate the domestic carbon risks associated with fossil fuel production and support economic development in line with climate and green growth ambitions will in every case depend upon their access to timely and accurate information and their capacity to incorporate it into long-term policy making across a range of areas.